All right, so let's start going through the activity. Sort of as always, feel free to stop, interrupt if something's not making sense to you. This is the whole advantage to doing this synchronously is that you all can do that. So don't hesitate to ask questions or anything like that as we're sort of going through these problems. So let's start with the first one. So a person should only tell the truth if it benefits them in some way. There is no moral obligation to be selfless, and telling the truth when it will harm you is certainly being selfless. So we'll do our standardization first. So first thing, identify the conclusion. In this case, there's no conclusion keyword really that gives everything away. So we have to rely on some sort of other criteria. And I would say that based on the question of what's the most controversial claim in this argument, I would certainly say it's this first one. Person should only tell the truth if it benefits them in some way. That so you can lie if it's convenient for you. That would be a pretty controversial claim. And again, the second two are sort of seemingly are giving us reasons to believe that that's true. So it sort of checks out. So the conclusion is our first sentence. Person should only tell the truth if it benefits them. All right, and then we just list our two premises in the order that we see them. There's no moral obligation to be selfless. And two, telling the truth when it harms you is being selfless. Notice that even though this is all one sentence, I did break it up into two premises. And the reason why is that these are two separate claims. It could be true there's no moral obligation to be selfless, but maybe false that telling the truth when it harms you is being selfless, or other way around perhaps. Right? They're separate claims, so we can treat them as separate premises. All right. So since these are simple problems, all we need to do now is figure out what kind of support the premises offer to the conclusion. Right. And we can use the same test that we did last time. We can try using either of these by themselves and seeing if they sort of give us a reason to believe that the conclusion is true. So if we said there's no moral obligation to be selfless, and therefore a person should only tell the truth when it benefits them, I think we'd say that kind of doesn't work, right? We're not really connecting this idea of sort of selflessness to the telling of the truth. Where's telling the truth even coming from if this is our only premise? Similarly, telling the truth when it harms you is being selfless. Therefore, a person should only tell the truth if it benefits them. All right, again, where are we sort of getting this idea of sort of right and wrong morality from it? Right, they only really make sense together. Again, we sort of seem like a rule that the condition for the rule is being satisfied. We here seem to have another example of link support. All right. So any thoughts, questions about that first problem? All right, then let's jump down to the second one. All right, so because of the constant instability in the region and the long-standing hostility of the Pardinians to foreigners, any peacekeeping force sent to Pardinia is doomed to fail. Again, in this case, we don't really have any conclusion keywords, but we do have this because. And because is a premise keyword, it indicates that what follows is likely to be a premise. So that would suggest that perhaps these two are premises and that the last is perhaps the conclusion. We can check it out. Any peacekeeping force sent to Pardinia is doomed to fail. That certainly sounds as if it would be a controversial claim if in the fictional world where Pardinian existed. Probably less controversial in these other two claims. Those are presumably just kind of facts that if you knew about Pardinia, you would sort of agree that those facts were true. And so therefore the conclusion in this case, by sort of multiple criteria, it seems to be our last sentence. Okay. And again, for our standardization, we now just have to list the other two premises as we see them. So here we're going to definitely need to reword things though. The constant instability in the region isn't even a sentence, so we have to sort of make it in a sentence, right? Maybe there is constant instability in the region around Pardinia. that sort of rewording of it, I think, makes it far clearer how that point is supposed to connect to the conclusion. Similarly, you can do the same thing with the second premise, the long-standing hostility of the Pardinians to foreigners. Again, let's just make that a sentence. The Pardinians have a long tradition of being hostile to outside foreigners, maybe. Again, yeah, there's different ways you could reword it. Our standardizations don't all have to look the same, but they all do have to be expressing the same basic claims. So then, same idea. Let's now turn to our diagramming. Same test. Let's see if these premises work individually as reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. And this time, I think they kind of do. There's constant instability in the region around Pardinia. Therefore, any peacekeeping force sent to Pardinia will fail. That kind of makes sense to me. I can, yeah, that indeed would be a reason to suspect that perhaps the peacekeeping force will fail. Similarly, the Pardinians have a long-standing tradition of being hostile to foreigners. Therefore, any peacekeeping force sent to Pardinia will fail. That too makes sense to me. I mean, I can see indeed why that would be a reason to think that the peacekeeping force won't work. They both work independently, so we're looking at independent support, which will show two individual arrows pointing up to our conclusion. Okay. Now, one important thing to note here, certainly this argument is stronger with both of them, right? Think of maybe in percentage terms, maybe the fact that there's constant instability in the region of Pardinia, maybe that gives you a 25% chance that the peacekeeping forces won't work. And maybe that the long tradition of hostility to foreigners, maybe that gives you another 25% chance that the peacekeeping force won't work. Okay, taken together, 50%, the argument's way stronger than they would be individually. What's going on here, though, isn't just that we're saying the argument is stronger if these two premises are both true. We're saying that the argument only makes sense if both of these two premises are true. That if either of the premises were not true, the argument would sort of stop making sense. Here, it could well turn out to be the case that maybe there hasn't been constant instability in the region of Pardinia, but we would still have a reason to think that the peacekeeping force might not work with the second premise. Again, how are we doing? Thoughts, questions, comments about anything up to the first two questions? All right, then let's move on to number 3. Come on, Zoom, stop being pain. There we go. All right, so number 3, we actually have a numbered list here. There are 3 very good reasons why the Gears of War games are terrible. All right, that sounds an awful lot like a conclusion, right? Here's what we're going to here's what this argument is going to tell you is true. There are 3 reasons why it's true, right? And indeed, that's sort of borne out. Everything else we see does indeed seem to be a reason to think that the Gears of War games are not good. So our conclusion is the first sentence. Again, we're going to want to rewrite it a little bit, though. The Gears of War games are not good, or the Gears of War games are even terrible. That's fine. Every other part of that first sentence is kind of irrelevant to the central claim, right? There are 3 very good reasons why. None of that really is the claim. They're more telling you that this claim is going to be a conclusion supported by 3 premises. All right. And then, so what are our 3 premises? Well, we have a numbered list. Each first, second, third. The reason I gave you this one to do is that this is going to be a really good key place to see why, sort of, when we're standardizing the argument, we sometimes really need to reword the premises to make them a little bit clearer, or reword the conclusion to make it a little bit clearer what it is that the claim actually is. So we see the first premise as it's written is that the characters in those games all look like over-muscled giants. Well, okay, why is that a bad thing? What's the actual critique here? Maybe someone could like a game where everyone looked like over-muscled giants. I mean, what's the actual critique? And it seems like the actual claim is something like the games have bad art or character design. That's far clearer a way better version of expressing what claim is being made here than the way that it's actually written. And it'll be easier to evaluate whether or not this claim is true as a result. Same thing is true, I think, in the case of the second premise that's given. The plots are always incredibly silly. But okay, again, why is that a bad thing? If it's a comedy game, you'd want a silly plot could maybe be a virtue, right? The claim has to be more basically that the plots just aren't very good. But maybe that they're poorly written, something like that. Again, that's just way clearer when we actually turn from just sort of like writing out the argument to actually evaluating it. This claim will be way easier to evaluate than the claim that the plots are silly. And then lastly, we've got that the gameplay, how does Zoom keep doing this? Yeah, the claim that the gameplay is boring. Again, that one I think we can pretty much actually just leave as it's sort of written. That's pretty clear. The gameplay is boring or not good. That's reasonably clear. We don't probably have to rewrite that one as much. But the argument's way clearer with the first two cases, at least if we rewrote the premises a little bit. We summarized them. We made the central claim clearer. All right. So now let's do our diagram. So unlike the examples we've looked at so far, we have three premises here. But that in and of itself doesn't really tell us much of anything. With these three premises, you could sort of have any number of possible options. Maybe all three of them are independent. Maybe all three of them are linked. Maybe 1 and 2 are linked and 3 is independent. All those options are in principle fine. So the fact that there's three premises, that in and of itself doesn't really tell us anything. So to tell what kind of support these premises use, we should indeed use the same test we've been using all this time. The games have bad art or character design, therefore they're bad. That makes sense. That by itself does indeed seem as if it is a reason to think that the game is bad. The plots in the games aren't good or that they're poorly written, therefore the games are bad. Again, that independently makes sense. That seems to give us a reason to believe that the conclusion is true. And again, the gameplay is boring, gameplay is not good, therefore the games are bad. That makes sense also independently. Each of these gives an independent reason to think that the conclusion is true. And almost always when you see a numbered list like this, like here are the 3 reasons why something is true, you're being given 3 distinct reasons. They sort of are all each going to stand alone. Each of them are going to be its own claim. And so if it turns out that you don't think that the gameplay is actually bad in the Gears of War games, you still have 2 other claims for why the games are bad that you would have to refute in order to refute the overall argument. So how are we doing with these basic standardizing problems? Does anyone have any questions or concerns about anything at this point? Okay, then let's turn now to the next set of problems where we're dealing with the principle of charity and dealing with sort of these cases where you are sort of going to be called upon to sort of rewrite the premises or maybe even the conclusion to make it a little bit clearer what's being claimed. All right, so let's look at number 4. So in this case, you got the argument comic books are basically about the triumph of traditional social norms over any form of deviancy. So the same thing is true of Green Lantern number 78. And in this case, I think there's multiple ways we could interpret this argument as it's sort of given to us. There's multiple renderings we can give it, especially this sort of like first claim. The comic books are basically about the triumph of social norms over any form of deviancy. There's different ways we could sort of interpret or read that claim. And so that's standardization 1, standardization 2. So how are these different? In standardization 1, we sort of read this claim as a universal, what's called universal generalization. We're talking about all comic books are about this one very specific thing. And in the second case, we read it as only talking about a great many comic books, meaning many comic books, most comic books even, some large percentage, but not all of them. And as a result of the differences between those 2 first premises, we also get 2 slightly different conclusions. In the first case, the conclusion is a necessary conclusion. It's necessarily the case that Green Lantern number 78 must have this property. Whereas if in the second case, the conclusion becomes more of a probabilistic one. It's likely to be true. We're actually going to talk about next week. This first reading of the argument makes it into a deductive argument, an argument where the conclusion is supposed to follow with certainty. Whereas the second makes it an inductive argument, an argument where the conclusion is only supposed to follow with some degree of probability. So if we're asked to choose between these 2 interpretations, and we don't have the author of the argument here to ask them what they meant, we should go with the one that makes the argument most likely to be a good argument. And I think with that as our criteria, standardization 1 is the more charitable. And why? What's the reason for this? Well, it's because the premise number 1 is, sorry, I said that backwards. Standardization 2 is the more charitable. Why? Because the premise 1 in the first standardization is very unlikely to be true. Because if we took this first premise seriously, we could prove it false if we could find a single counterexample, one single comic book that wasn't about this. We're probably going to do that. There's millions probably of comic books written by this point in human history. We're probably going to find one that doesn't fall under the theme. It's very unlikely that that universal generalization is true. Whereas on the second reading, the premise is more likely to be true. And so as a result of that, an argument that has false premises is not going to be a good argument. So standardization 2 is far more likely to be a good argument. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the principle of charity. Now, if the person that we're talking to responds and says, no, 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 I mean this as a universal generalization, fine, then we'll change back, right? But if we have two plausible ways we could read what they're saying, we should go with the one that's more likely to produce a good argument rather than the one that's less likely to produce a good argument. Again, everyone good? Anyone want to make a claim for the opposite, for one being more charitable? All right, then let's go look at the second of these two problems. All right, so this is a real world argument. This is an argument from my Uncle Joe. Real case. All right, I hate taxes. I barely have enough money as it is, and then the government comes in and takes what little I have left. We ought to do something about this. Okay, so what does my Uncle Joe mean? In this case, the part that seems most ambiguous isn't really the premises. The premises seem more or less clear what he probably means. It's actually probably this last part, this conclusion. We ought to do something about this. That's pretty vague, right? Like, what ought we to do about it? What is he sort of implying should be done? Right, now, I know my Uncle Joe, so I can tell you what he actually meant. But you all don't know him, right? So you should look at what's the most charitable thing to assume that he means via this conclusion. And so I came up with two standardizations, two different conclusions in this case that the argument's going to come to. So the first one, many people like me can barely make ends meet. Taxes add an unsustainable burden to such people. Therefore, the current tax code is unfair and should be made fairer. Or the conclusion, taxes should be completely abolished and no one should pay anything to the government. And so two different conclusions in this case. Okay, which is the more charitable? Well, in this case, I think we want to say number one is the more charitable. Because, so why? What's the justification for this? Because the conclusion, the second standardization, is far more extreme than the one in number one. Now, that doesn't mean that extreme conclusions can't be true. It doesn't mean that people can't be proposing extreme conclusions. But a more extreme conclusion requires higher levels of evidence to support it. So if we read the conclusion as being more extreme, we're going to have to hold my uncle's argument to a higher standard, right? And the evidence that he's presenting, we're going to have to hold it to a higher standard. Whereas this claim is actually pretty mild in standardization one, right? The current tax code is unfair and should be made fairer. I think probably almost everyone thinks that's true. I mean, like to some, I mean, maybe they disagree about how it's unfair and how it should be made fairer, but that there's something wrong with the tax code, I think almost everyone probably would agree with that. So the kind of evidence needed to support this less extreme claim will be smaller, or a lower standard maybe we'll have to apply. And so therefore, standardization 1 is more likely to give us a good argument. Now, again, that doesn't mean that either argument would actually be good, right? Or that both are or that the more extreme argument is bad. It's just if we had to choose, we should go with the one that's more likely to yield a good argument, and standardization 1 is more likely to yield a good argument. Now, knowing my Uncle Joe, he probably meant the second one. That's probably what he meant, right? Fine, right? And indeed, if we got him wrong, he'd be happy to correct us about what he really means, maybe, right? But again, you all not knowing him, right? You're not in a position to sort of make that sort of guess about what it is that he meant. You should go with the more charitable interpretation. Let him correct you if you're talking to him and he disagrees with it. And indeed, frequently what will actually happen if you adopt a sort of more moderate conclusion, if someone's being a little bit hyperbolic and unclear, frequently people will actually sort of move into the more moderate conclusion as being what they meant all along, and it'll be easier to have an actual conversation with it. People aren't always clear to themselves what they mean when they make these arguments, and that's another virtue of sort of being charitable. You can get people to sort of like mean something more plausible if you sort of read them as meaning something more plausible. Whereas if you read them as meaning something more extreme, people will often just jump to the more extreme thing that maybe they didn't even originally meant. But since you're critiquing them for saying that they now have to double down and defend the more extreme thing. So how's everyone feeling with this principle of charity stuff? Any questions, thoughts, comments about any of it? Piper, is that a thumbs up? Okay, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, good. All right. Then if people are feeling good, let's turn now. The last one we'll end today with is an example of a harder diagramming problem. And what we'll do all of on Thursday is examples of these harder problems. But what makes the harder problems harder is just that they're longer, actually. Like, that's pretty much it. It's actually the same procedure, really, that you'll employ for the harder problems as the simple problems. They're just longer. There's more steps to look at. So the way I sort of asked you to sort of talk your way through this harder problem in number 6 is sort of the kind of way I'd actually recommend approaching all of these problems, just talking it through to yourself first. So let us get back to the problem. So, all right, whatever we do, the United States should not intervene in the affairs of Sardinia. First, it would be illegal. Legally speaking, the principle of national sovereignty requires every nation to refrain from interfering in the domestic affairs of other nations without consent. Besides, the situation in Sardinia is a mess of factions and long-standing grudges. Intervention would not make a positive difference in such a conflict. Okay. Here's how I recommend we approach this problem. Close the browser. Shut it down. Turn it over. Move the page. Don't look at it for a second. You all read long, complicated things all the time. Right? This isn't new to you. And indeed, you all hear arguments like this and interpret arguments like this all the time. Again, it's not something new. What's new is that I am asking you to look at sort of every individual sentence of the argument. That's where I found people get confused. This is just from when people sort of struggle with these harder problems, that actually seems to me as why they're struggling. They're struggling because they're almost getting lost in the weeds and not just almost taking a step back and saying, okay, what is this argument actually claiming? Because if you do that, frequently you can write yourself a pretty detailed map, actually, that you can then fill in with all the details after the fact. So, having read that argument, what's the conclusion? What does this argument want me to believe? The U.S. shouldn't intervene. That pretty clearly seems to be what the argument wants me to believe. Okay, why? Don't worry about the specifics, right? Don't look at the specific sentences even yet. Just why should the U.S. not intervene? Well, one reason it seems to be like it would be illegal. What's the other reason? It's not going to work. Now, there is no sentence. I mean, maybe this one sort of is roughly close. It would be illegal, so we can maybe find that one. But there is no sentence in number 6 that says it won't work, right? And yet, that does seem to be the thrust of sort of the second half of the argument. It's not going to work. All right, writing it that simple, summarizing it to yourself in that way will be really helpful when you go back to the more complicated what's actually written to help you figure out what to do with it. And then if you ask yourself, okay, well, why would it be illegal? Well, it has something to do with this principle of national sovereignty. That's why it would be illegal. Similarly, why is it not going to work? Because there's a lot of grudges and factions. And it can be helpful even write it all the way out, right? It would be illegal because. It's not going to work because. What you've done is you've written yourself out a map. You've summarized the argument for yourself, and now you've given yourself a map that you can use. Now all you have to do is just sort of like almost translate what's written here down to the map that you've given yourself. So we can begin our standardization now. So conclusion, the United States should not intervene in the affairs of Sardinia. First sentence. What are the reasons? Okay, for the standardization, we just list them in the order that we see them within the argument. It would be illegal. 2, legally speaking, the principle of national sovereignty. Yada, yada, yada. When you're doing your standardization, feel you can do this, it's fine. Just a dot it, right? You don't necessarily need to write the whole sentence out. You just need to make sure it's clear what sentence you're pointing to. 3, the situation in Sardinia is a mess of factions and grudges. 4, intervention would not make a positive difference. In such a conflict. All right. But notice how much more detailed even your summary is in the standardization, right? The standardization just lists the premises. You've already, in this sort of summary, done way more than that. You've expressed how all these various things relate to one another. So now let's take our standardization, let's diagram it. All right, so we'll put our conclusion on the top, as always. The easy part. And then if we were to ask, okay, how many primary premises are there? Well, we've already actually answered that question. How many primary premises are there? We've said that there are 2. Right? It would be illegal. It won't work. All right. So let's go back to the diagram then. Which one is it would be illegal? That seems to be number 1. Come on, canvas. Resume. All right. We said the second one was that it won't work. Which of these most closely corresponds with it won't work? Probably number 4, right? Intervention won't make a positive difference. Intervention won't work. All right. All right. Now, why would it be illegal? Well, we said it had something to do with that whole principle of national sovereignty thing. Well, okay, that's the second sentence. So it turns out we have a subordinate premise here. Number 2. Number 2 doesn't give us a reason to believe that the conclusion is true. It gives us a reason to believe that the first premise is true. And it's independent support because it's the only one. If you only ever have one premise, it's got to be independent support. You can't have linked premises unless you have 2 premises to link together. Similarly, we said, what is the reason to believe that intervention won't make a positive difference? Well, we said it was the mess of factions and grudges. Well, okay, that seems to be the third sentence, the third premise. And again, that reason is by itself, so it sort of can't be link support. All right. Now what about 1 and 4? So we know these are primary premises, right? They directly lead us to believe the conclusion is true. We also know that they're part of a subordinate argument. They're subordinate conclusions, but we can sort of leave that fact behind for a moment. Do these premises independently give us a reason to believe that the conclusion is true? Or do they only make sense if they're taken together? Okay, it would be illegal, so therefore the United States shouldn't do something. I think that makes sense. You shouldn't do something because it's illegal. That makes sense on its own. Similarly, you shouldn't do something because it's not going to work. I think, again, that makes sense on its own. Right? That itself makes sense. Independent support for both of them. So we've got our diagram. We've got the conclusion. We've got primary premises and then subordinate premises that give us reason to believe that those premises are true. Everything is independent support. Okay. Nothing's linked together. We now have a very clear sense of how this argument works and how we would need to go about evaluating it. We'd probably need to begin by evaluating 2 and 3. See if those actually hold up to scrutiny. Because if they don't, we don't have any good reasons to believe that 1 and 4 are true. But if only, let's say 2 is false. Let's say the principle of national sovereignty does allow humanitarian intervention, maybe. We still would have to deal with this other side of the argument because the other side of the argument doesn't really mesh with or overlap with this first side. So we now have sort of a map about how we can go about evaluating the argument. How are people feeling with that last problem, number 6? The diagram makes sense? All right, good. The more difficult ones are where it gets hard, right? I mean, there's no other two ways around it, right? And this is a case where you just sort of have to practice these, get good at them, and you will get good at them if you keep practicing at it, if you work on it, coming with office hours. What we're going to do on Thursday, we're just going to go pretty much straight in. I'm going to give you 5 hard problems and have you and your group work on all 5 of them. Get really good at them together. I'm also going to give you a list of hints. So if you're struggling on a problem, look at the hints, and I'm also then going to give you the answer. And then I want you all to look at the answer together. Basically, I don't want me going through this again. That's of minimal helpfulness. What'll be really helpful next class period is you all teaching each other how to do this. You all looking at the answers together and trying to figure out why what I'm saying is the right answer, using the hints that I give. That's what we'll do on Thursday. And hopefully that should put you in a really good position to do these problems on the exam. All right, so we can end it here for today, unless anyone has any last things. Just get me, in terms of the document you turn into me, make sure you give me some kind of diagram. There's different ways of doing it. You can take a picture of it that you've written out by hand, add it to the document that way. Some people do it just via pure text, just sort of using like a little, a dash or whatever to indicate link support. Whatever you do, just make sure it's clear enough that I can follow it. I'll be pretty broad in what I take and what I accept. And for the exam, we'll do all of this with multiple choice, so you don't have to really worry about uploading anything with these problems. Make it a little bit easier. All right. Have a good rest of the week, everyone. I'll see you on Thursday. Bye.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
So I have another quick question for you
Sure,
on
go ahead.
the diagram. So I wrote it out on a page. My first question is, should I write out the full premises and conclusion and then draw a box around it and connect it, or just do the numbers?
If you've done the standardization first, which you're supposed to have done, but if you've done the standardization first, then just using the numbers should be fine.
Okay, and then my second question is, since I did it all on one page, would it be okay for me to just upload one picture of the big page, or
Sure.
should I break it up?
No, that's completely fine. Yeah, it's completely fine if you want to do it that way. I think you can actually upload multiple files as part of the submission. So maybe you can, have the answer, all the answers or whatever, and then all the diagrams on a second page, and I can cross-reference it or however you want to do it. It's hard to upload this stuff, so I'm going to be pretty open to whatever. Just so long as it's clear to me what it is you're doing, it should be fine.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.
Bye.